That night, I managed to dial 911, but they didn't hear me whisper, "Please." The call dropped, and no one called back. I ran to the neighbor's door. I knew they were home. I heard the television and saw the warm light under the crack. But no one answered. He was already coming up the stairs, barefoot, quiet, just like always. I had 10 seconds, and one object on the kitchen shelf I had sworn never to touch, but I touched it. And now they say I'm guilty. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Linda Reeves. I was 39 years old, and I worked the night shift as an ER nurse in a small hospital in northern Kentucky. I had learned over the years to keep my voice steady while someone else's heart stopped under my hands, to move quickly in blood-soaked shoes without flinching, and to press on someone's chest while their family sobbed a few feet away. I knew how to save lives, but I had never learned how to save my own. The house we lived in looked ordinary, almost pleasant in the daytime. It had pale blue shutters and a porch swing I'd painted myself one spring before everything turned gray. There were azaleas out front that bloomed too early, and a crooked birdhouse on a pole that never seemed to attract any birds. If someone drove by on a Sunday afternoon, they might think we were just another quiet suburban couple. No one would have guessed that every night inside that house was a slow descent into terror. The front steps creaked in a certain way, depending on who was walking on them. I had memorized the rhythm of his stride, the heavier thud of his boots when he was angry, the soft, deliberate tap of socks when he was waiting to catch me off guard. But it was the stairs inside, the ones leading from the hallway up to our bedroom, that told me what kind of night I was about to endure. After midnight, those steps betrayed secrets. They stretched like nerves under thin skin, and they always creaked differently when violence was coming. I would lie in bed, still in my scrubs sometimes, the scent of antiseptic still clinging to my hands, pretending to be asleep while my ears strained for the sound. One footstep meant he was going to the kitchen. Two meant he was in the hallway. Three was the beginning of fear, because three meant he was coming upstairs. And when he came upstairs after midnight, it was never to sleep. I had once loved him, I think. Or maybe I loved the man I thought he could become. I clung to memories like old photographs, slightly blurred, edges curling, the truth fading in the sunlight of repeated lies. He hadn't always hit me. That came later. First, it was silence, then contempt, then isolation, then the first time, quick, shocking, followed by hours of apologies and shaking hands offering ice wrapped in a dish towel. The shame of it wasn't the bruise. It was the knowledge that I stayed. I stayed through the slow erosion of who I was. I stayed when my friends stopped inviting me to things because I always had an excuse. I stayed when I began to flinch at every sudden sound. I stayed when I started waking up at 3 a.m. for no reason, drenched in sweat, heart racing, even when he wasn't touching me. I stayed when my patients at the hospital whispered about me in the staff break room. I stayed because he said he loved me. I stayed because leaving felt like jumping out of a moving car. I stayed because I was tired, and tired women make the quietest prisoners. Every object in the house became something else. The hallway mirror became a witness. The carpet became camouflage. The kitchen table became a courtroom where I had to plead my worth over breakfast. The bathroom became a place to cry into towels so no sound escaped the tiles. And the stairs, God, the stairs, they became an omen. I knew every creak by heart. Step 5 always groaned like a tired lung. Step 8 let out a whisper like it was trying to warn me. But it was step 10 that mattered most. Step 10 was outside our bedroom. Step 10 meant the door handle would turn next. Some nights, I tried to beat him to sleep. I would pretend to be exhausted, curl up on the far edge of the bed, my back to the door, breathing slowly, evenly. But he always knew. He knew when I was pretending. He'd stand at the threshold, just watching. I could feel it in my spine, a stillness too thick to breathe in. I would count my breaths, hoping he would leave, praying he wouldn't speak, because his voice was the fuse and his silence was the match. I began to move objects around the house like a silent game of defense. I kept the sharpest knife in the second drawer instead of the first. I stacked empty boxes against the back door, so if I ever had to run, I'd trip less. I put a flashlight under the couch cushion and a burner phone in the medicine cabinet wrapped in gauze. These were not the acts of a free woman. These were the rituals of someone waiting for a war inside her own walls. People asked me why I didn't leave. Not to my face, of course, but I saw it in their eyes, heard it in their questions. Are you okay? You seem tired. Rough night? I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that fear is not rational, that you don't just wake up one day and pack a bag and walk out, especially when you know he has your passwords, your bank account access, your location history, especially when you know he's threatened to hurt someone you love if you ever speak out. I once tried to tell a colleague, a kind older nurse named Joyce. We were folding linens in the back hallway of the hospital, and she said something about her ex-husband, and I almost told her. I said, "It's been hard at home." And she nodded and said, "Well, marriage is work." I nodded back. That was the last time I tried. There was one night. I don't know why it stood out. Maybe because it was quieter than usual. He didn't say a word when I came in, just sat in the chair, staring at the blank TV screen. I passed behind him like a shadow, barely breathing, and climbed the stairs in socks so they wouldn't hear me. But the creak of step 6 betrayed me. I froze, waited, nothing. Maybe he hadn't noticed. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan spinning its slow, indifferent circles. And when the first creak came, just past 2 a.m., I already knew. The pattern. 1, pause, 2, longer pause, 3, silence, 4, 5. Then that long sighing groan of step 8. I gripped the edge of the mattress like it could anchor me to the floor. Step 10. I never heard the door open. I only felt the air change. That's the thing no one tells you about fear. It has a weight, a temperature, a smell. It's like metal and sweat and something just before lightning. My body braced, but I didn't move. I just counted again. My own breath, the thudding of my heart, the sound of the world shrinking to a pinpoint. That night, he didn't hit me. That night, he whispered something I didn't understand and walked away. And I lay there until sunrise, staring at the ceiling, realizing I hadn't blinked in hours. I knew then that something had shifted, not in him, in me. The steps would always creak. The house would always groan. But something inside me had stopped being afraid of ghosts and started being afraid of the living. And that was far more dangerous. I used to believe in phone calls. I believed that when you dialed those 3 numbers, someone would come. I believed that emergencies mattered, that pain had a protocol, that if your voice trembled enough, if you whispered the right words into the receiver, "Please, he's hurting me. Please, I think I'm going to die," Someone on the other end would hear you and help would arrive. But belief fades slowly, like bruises do. First, you stop calling. Then you stop hoping. Then you stop answering at all. The first time I called 911, I still had faith. I was younger, maybe 32, and still had the voice of someone who thought she mattered. My husband had thrown a glass at the wall, not at me, but close enough to make me slip on the shards as I tried to clean them up. The dispatcher had a calm voice, like she was reading from a script in a language I didn't fully understand. "Is he there now?" she asked. "Is he armed? Is he violent?" I said yes. I said I was scared. I said I didn't know what to do. She said they'd send someone, but no one came. Later, I learned the call had been deprioritized. Domestic dispute. No injuries. No urgency. I went to work the next day with a long cut along my thigh, hidden beneath compression socks, and a silence I had just begun to practice. The second time I called, he had shoved me against the kitchen counter. I couldn't find my phone at first. It had slipped under the table when he grabbed my arm. When I did get it, my hands were shaking so badly I dialed 911 twice before I hit the right sequence. The dispatcher's voice this time was younger, distracted, like she was scrolling through something else. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in immediate danger?" she asked. I said I thought so. She said to wait in another room. I did, for 3 hours. No one ever knocked. By the third time, I started to feel foolish, like a child pulling a fire alarm in a building that never burns. I whispered through the phone from inside the bathroom, my back against the locked door, while he banged on it, screaming words that only sounded human because they had syllables. The dispatcher said help was on the way. I watched the shadow of his feet move back and forth under the crack. Then they stopped. Then he was silent. Then the house was silent. I stayed in that bathroom until morning. Still no one came. That day, I stopped believing in sirens. People think silence is safe, that if you're quiet, the danger passes. But silence, in houses like ours, is a predator. It waits. It stretches time like taffy until minutes become hours and hours become eternities. And the worst part is not the violence. It's the way the world treats your cries as static. There were nights I would dial the number and just hold the phone in my hand, listening to nothing, not even pressing send, just pretending I had someone on the other end. It was the only time I felt heard. One night I called and they answered, and then they hung up. I remember staring at the screen like I'd just been slapped. The cold beep that followed was louder than any scream. I redialed, but I couldn't make my fingers move fast enough. My hands were swollen, one of my fingernails cracked at the base. The pain was dull, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. No one followed up. No one came. The next morning, I made coffee and washed blood from the floor with bleach. The phone sat on the counter, useless, like a mouth that could speak but never scream. I started avoiding phones altogether. I wouldn't answer when my sister called. I let messages pile up, unread and unheard. The sound of a ringtone made my stomach twist. I changed it to silent. I didn't want to hear false hope ring. I remember once seeing a commercial, some dramatic reenactment of a woman dialing 911, her voice trembling, the lights flashing red and blue within seconds. It felt like a fairy tale, a bedtime story told by people who have never heard the creak of a stairwell past midnight or the snap of a belt in the dark. I changed the channel. Neighbors heard things. I know they did. I saw curtains flutter late at night. I saw lights flick on, then off, like eyes blinking in confusion or guilt. One time, I tried to knock on a neighbor's door after he'd locked me outside in my nightgown, my bare feet numb on the cold concrete, breath puffing like smoke. I knocked once, then again, then I stopped, because I saw their shadow behind the peephole. They were home. They just didn't want to be part of it. People like to believe that pain is loud, that screams will bring witnesses, and witnesses will bring justice. But I learned the truth. Pain is quiet. Pain slips under doors and hides in closets. Pain answers the phone and says, "We can't help right now." Pain makes people pretend they didn't hear anything. Eventually, I started keeping a notebook. I would write down what happened, because if no one would listen, I needed proof I hadn't imagined it. Pages filled with dates and times. 3:12 a.m. woke me up by dumping water on me. 10:46 p.m. threw phone across room. 5:03 p.m. said he would make sure no one ever believed me. It felt like writing on the inside of a coffin lid. That notebook became my second voice, the one I didn't trust phones to carry. It had a ribbon bookmark and coffee stains, and one page torn out after he found it and ripped it down the middle. But I taped it back. I kept writing. I wanted to believe again, that someone would listen, that someone would hear me. But there's a threshold you cross after enough calls go unanswered, a place where hope is dangerous and silence becomes armor. I crossed that line quietly, without ceremony. One night I picked up the phone, looked at it, and set it back down without touching a single button. And in that moment, I stopped believing in rescue, because no one saves the woman who's called too many times. No one listens when the screaming becomes routine. No one knocks when your name is only associated with trouble. So I learned to live without the sound of ringing. I learned that if I were ever to be saved, it wouldn't be by anyone on the other end of the line. It would be by the woman who finally stopped calling and started listening to herself. It began like all the other nights, but I knew even before the moon rose fully behind the bare trees that something had changed in me. There was a stillness in the house that felt too perfect, too rehearsed, a kind of hush that only lives in places that expect violence. I had become so used to the patterns, the way the day unwound itself into dusk, and dusk into silence, and silence into the steady beat of fear. But this night held a fracture. The air tasted different. I remember that, cooler, sharper, as if winter had crept into the walls. I moved through the kitchen like I always did, keeping to the right side of the tiles to avoid the one that clicked under pressure. I placed a mug on the counter, quietly, deliberately. The lights were low. The clock ticked too loud. My reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger, a woman who used to belong to someone else. He hadn't come home yet. That should have brought relief, but it didn't. His absence carried its own weight, like a tidal wave drawing back before it strikes. I knew what followed. Each time he returned late, it meant the fuse was shorter, the storm closer, the damage deeper. I glanced at the drawer, the one with the flashlight and matches and batteries, and beneath them, the thing I'd hidden weeks ago, wrapped in a dishcloth that had once been white, but now bore a wine-colored stain from a night best forgotten. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I sat at the table and stared at my hands. They were no longer delicate, no longer innocent. The skin was tougher. A scar curved around my thumb, healed but still pink. I traced it with the opposite finger, remembering how it got there. He'd slammed a cabinet door while I reached in for plates, said it was my fault, said I moved too slow. That night, I cleaned the blood myself and apologized for bleeding on the floor. At 10:14 p.m., his headlights swept across the living room. My body reacted before my mind did, heart racing, breath shortening, every nerve standing at attention, like prey sensing the tremor of an approaching predator. I stood slowly and poured myself a glass of water I wouldn't drink. My hand trembled. I set the glass down. I had learned long ago to keep my hands empty when he walked in. Any object could become a weapon. Any sound could be the spark. The door opened. His keys hit the bowl. His boots scraped against the mat. That sound, God, that sound, was louder than thunder. He didn't speak when he entered. He rarely did. Just dropped his coat over the chair and moved past me like I was air. I could smell him, liquor and cigarette smoke and something sour beneath it. He turned on the television, sat down, started flipping channels. I stood by the sink, waiting for the verdict of the evening. Would he ignore me? Would he erupt? That night he asked for dinner. Not demanded, asked. That's when I knew something was wrong. He never asked. The word itself was foreign from his mouth, soft, almost human. I moved quickly, not trusting it. I pulled leftovers from the fridge and heated them, my back to him, my ears straining. Every rustle of his clothes, every creak of the couch, every breath. I knew him too well, knew that quietness didn't mean peace, it meant calculation. When I placed the plate in front of him, he looked up at me with a smile. My skin crawled. He said, "Thank you." I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. He never said thank you. He ate in silence. I stood a few feet away, pretending to tidy up, pretending not to be a prisoner in my own kitchen. Then he started talking about the news, about the neighbors, about the weather. It was casual, easy, normal, and that was terrifying. He had never made small talk with me. He had only ever used his voice to command or condemn. Something in him had shifted, but it wasn't kindness. It was premeditation. When he stood up, I tensed. He walked toward me, slowly, too slowly. Then he reached up to a cupboard above my head and pulled out a bottle of wine. My breath caught. He poured 2 glasses, handed one to me. I didn't take it. He insisted. I took it. He toasted. To us. I didn't move. Then he laughed, that low, cruel laugh that curled like smoke into every crevice of my spine. He said something about second chances, about how lucky I was, about how most women like me ended up dead or gone or worse. And then, just like that, the kindness vanished. His hand clamped around my wrist, hard. The wine glass shattered on the floor. He didn't even flinch. His face twisted into something ancient, something monstrous. He said I had made him look like a fool last week, that he knew I'd talked to the cashier at the grocery store too long, that I was flirting, that I was ungrateful, that he should remind me who I belonged to. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the drawer, and that's when it all changed. He pushed me backward. My hip hit the counter. My elbow scraped the cabinet. I didn't fall. Not yet. His voice rose, filled with that strange kind of fury that doesn't need logic to exist. I felt the sting in my jaw before I even realized he'd struck me. My head snapped to the side. The room tilted, and in that tilted room, something ancient in me woke up. I stepped to the side. He followed. I stumbled toward the drawer. He laughed. But I wasn't reaching for a towel. I wasn't reaching for a flashlight. I pulled out the dishcloth, and in one movement, I unwrapped the thing I had wrapped so carefully so long ago. The knife, the one I used to chop onions and potatoes and excuses. His eyes widened. He took a step forward, called me a name I'd heard 100 times, maybe 1,000. But that night, it didn't sink in. That night, I wasn't the woman who flinched, or apologized, or cleaned the blood. That night, I didn't feel like a victim. That night, I didn't feel anything at all. Because that night, everything was different. They told me to wear something respectful. I chose a gray blouse and the only black skirt I owned that didn't have a hem coming undone. My shoes were too tight. I'd lost weight, but my feet still bore the swell of sleepless nights and prison tiles. I sat in the back of the transport van, my wrists aching from the cuffs. They told me to keep my head down when walking through the back entrance of the courthouse, but the sky was overcast and there was nothing up there worth looking at anyway. The hall smelled like disinfectant and old wood. Courtrooms always did. A kind of permanent sterility that tries to wash away the fear and judgment that hang in the air like smoke. I had never been in one before as anything but a voter, a taxpayer, a woman watching legal dramas from the safety of her couch. That day, I wasn't any of those things. I was the accused, a number in a file, a face they passed around like a problem to be solved. They walked me into the courtroom, and I saw the back of my lawyer's head. He didn't turn when I sat down, just tapped his pen again and again, like a man watching time dissolve into water. I looked around the room. It was smaller than I expected. Fewer pews, fewer faces. But the ones who were there didn't blink. They stared at me like I was already gone. The prosecution began before the coffee in their cups had cooled. They spoke of rage, of a crime of passion. They called me dangerous, volatile, calculated. The man I had killed, his name rolled off their tongues like scripture, was described as a hard-working, misunderstood husband. A troubled man, yes, but one who didn't deserve to die like that. Their voices rose with righteousness. They painted a mural of love turned sour, of a woman who snapped and chose violence. No one mentioned bruises. No one mentioned hospital visits. No one mentioned fear. The photos came out next. I had seen them before, but they still turned something inside me to salt. The pool of blood on our kitchen floor, the shattered wine glass, the angle of his arm as it bent the wrong way. And me sitting in the corner, holding my knees, eyes wide like a child who wandered into a nightmare and didn't know how to walk back out. They said I hadn't called 911, that I had waited too long, that my voice on the tape was too calm, that my story had changed between the officer's questions and the detectives. They said I showed no remorse, that I had never cried for him, that I hadn't wept when they took his body away. I wanted to scream that I had run out of tears long before that night, that my grief had been stolen in pieces over a decade, one insult, one blow, one slammed door at a time. But I said nothing. My lawyer had warned me, let the facts speak, let the law speak. But the law had gone hoarse. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood. He was clean-shaven and tired. He told the story in softer colors. He spoke of a quiet woman, a good worker, a neighbor who volunteered at bake sales. He told them I had no criminal record, that I had tried to leave, that I had filed police reports, 3 to be exact, that I had been to the emergency room 5 times in 8 years. He showed them photos of my bruises. They stared at them like they were bad art, unconvincing, out of focus. He showed them my journal, the one where I had documented the pain. The entries were neat, desperate. I watched the jury blink slowly as the words were read out. They didn't flinch. One of them, a woman in a blue blouse, leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms. I wondered if she had ever slept with the door locked from the inside, if she had ever turned on a radio just to drown out silence before a scream, if she knew what it meant to live like prey in your own home. The defense called a neighbor. She said she had heard arguments, screaming, thuds, but she had never called the police. She didn't want to get involved. I stared at her, remembering the night I had stood barefoot on the porch, whispering through her mailbox slot, begging for help she never gave. Then came the expert, a woman in glasses and a navy suit. She spoke of trauma, of battered woman syndrome, of adrenaline and disassociation and fight-or-flight responses. She used words like reptilian brain and chronic terror. She said my actions were consistent with a person who believed she was about to die. The prosecution objected, called it speculation. The judge overruled, and yet I saw it, the doubt, the hesitation, not about whether I had killed him, they knew I had, but whether I had earned it, whether a woman like me, small and soft and ordinary, had the right to survive in the only way left to her. I watched their faces. None of them looked like mine, not in life, not in sorrow, not in fear. They sat in judgment, but they had never been woken by footsteps after midnight and wondered if their breath would be their last. When I took the stand, my knees locked. My hands trembled. The microphone was cold. I told them what happened, not just that night, but all the nights before. I told them about the broken plates, the broken ribs, the night he threw my wedding ring down the garbage disposal, the time he pushed me down the stairs and told me to tell the doctors I was clumsy. I spoke of silence, of survival, of how some of us live like ghosts long before we ever stop breathing. They listened, but I knew they didn't hear me. The verdict came 2 days later. I wore the same gray blouse, the same tight shoes, the same ache in my wrists. They found me guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. The judge said something about tragedy, about consequences, about the limits of self-defense. He didn't look at me when he sentenced me to 15 years, just shuffled his papers and nodded at the bailiff. They led me away. And as I walked through that courtroom, past the people who never really saw me, past the walls that never echoed back truth, I realized that I had not lost my freedom that day. I had lost it years ago. On the first night, I learned to whisper instead of scream. The cell door shut behind me with the sound of something final, a low metallic groan, like the last breath of a steel lung, followed by a silence that was not peaceful, but permanent. I stood there for a while, not sitting, not moving, just letting the cold breath of the concrete wrap around my skin. The air smelled of bleach, rust, and something older, something sour and sad, like disappointment that had never left. They called it a holding block, but I knew what it was. It was a place where people were unpeeled, layer by layer, until only silence remained. No curtains, no photos, no clocks. Time didn't belong to us anymore. The walls were painted a color that had no name, somewhere between mildew and regret, and they hummed, always hummed, with the distant buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. My cot was bolted to the wall, like they didn't trust me with freedom even while I slept. The mattress was thin, barely more than a pad, wrapped in plastic that squeaked every time I turned. I didn't cry that first night. I didn't have the strength. I just lay there, my arms folded across my stomach, eyes open, watching the ceiling as if it might part like clouds and show me a different version of myself, a version that had been believed. The cell was 6 paces long and 3 wide. I measured it with my bare feet over and over, as if mapping it would give me ownership. I made up names for the cracks in the floor. I learned which tile held warmth the longest after the guards passed. I traced the rust stain near the toilet with my eyes until it began to look like a bird in flight. That too was a lie, but one I needed to believe. What surprised me was how the walls never lied. They didn't pretend to be fair. They didn't tell you they understood. They didn't look away from bruises or change their minds about who you were. They just stood, heavy and indifferent, and accepted you entirely. There was honesty in that, a cold kind of truth I had never found in people. Letters came, but not from anyone I had once called family. A social worker, a women's group I didn't remember signing up for. One came from a stranger who had read about the trial in the local paper. She wrote that she believed me, that she wished she had said something when it was her sister, years ago. She ended with a line I read until the ink nearly faded. The system may have failed you, but you did not fail yourself. I taped that letter to the underside of my cot. I touched it like a prayer. The other women kept to themselves. Some had been there longer than I had been married. Their silence wasn't standoffish. It was survival. They moved like ghosts, shoulders curled, eyes flat. No one asked what you did. No one cared. We had all done something, or been something, or failed to do something quickly enough. Sometimes, late at night, a scream would echo through the corridor, not always human. Sometimes it was a sound ripped from the throat of the building itself, a pipe groaning, a rat skittering behind the wall. But other times it was a cry that shook the steel doors, that made me sit up and press my back to the cement just to feel something solid. I watched women lose themselves in the quiet. One scraped the same patch of paint from the wall with her thumbnail until it bled. Another whispered names in her sleep, names that probably didn't belong to her anymore. I kept my voice inside me, buried like a seed in winter. If I let it out, it might never come back. The food came on trays that smelled like wet cardboard, gray meat, colorless peas, a pudding cup with a foil lid that shimmered with condensation. I ate slowly because it passed the time. Every spoonful was a small rebellion. I was still alive after all. The guards weren't cruel, just bored. That made it worse. Cruelty has shape, direction. Boredom floats like gas. One looked through me every day like I was part of the architecture. Another called me ma'am with mechanical politeness, as if decency had to be written into policy. There was one window, a slit too narrow to see the sky, but wide enough to catch the glow of sunrise when it came. I marked it in my mind, how the light crept down the opposite wall like a silent promise. The sun didn't care who I was. It showed up anyway. It showed up for all of us. The days blurred, but not from lack of memory, from repetition. Every morning, the same clang of metal, the same call of numbers, the same wet mop across the corridor floor. I watched a spider weave a web in the corner above the toilet. When it disappeared, I mourned it like a neighbor. I wrote letters I never sent, to my mother, to my sister, to the friend who stopped calling after my arrest. I wrote one to the man I had killed. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I told him he didn't get to have that from me. I told him I was still afraid of him, but that I was learning to be more afraid of the part of me that had accepted him for so long. And I talked to the walls, not aloud, not with words, but with my body, my breath, my stillness. I let them hold my truths because people hadn't. Because every time I told the truth to someone with a badge or a gavel, they treated it like fiction. In those walls, I found a strange clarity. They didn't promise hope, but they didn't take it away either. They were steady, present, merciless, and merciful in equal measure. And maybe that was what I needed. Not forgiveness, not justice, just a place that wouldn't pretend to care, but also wouldn't pretend I didn't exist. I stopped counting days. I started counting things that were mine: the rhythm of my breath, the calluses on my hands from cleaning, the letter under my cot, the bird-shaped rust stain, the warmth of morning light on a single patch of concrete, and the silence, yes, even the silence. Because for the first time in years, no one was using it to punish me. I used to whisper, "I'm sorry," even in my sleep. It clung to my breath like second skin, slipped between my teeth when I opened my mouth to speak, and bloomed in my throat like a weed. I said it for stepping too loudly, for existing in the wrong room at the wrong time, for taking up too much space, for not being soft enough, small enough, quiet enough. I apologized to walls, to empty chairs, to closed doors. I apologized to the woman in the mirror, even as I wiped the blood from her cheek with trembling fingers. But something changed in me, and it didn't happen like lightning. It was slower than that. It began like a shift in temperature, barely noticeable at first. A hesitation where there had once been instinct, a held breath instead of an apology, a moment of silence where I might have once rushed to soothe everyone else. Prison didn't teach me this. Pain did. And pain, as I learned, is a teacher that does not ask for permission. There was a day when I stood in the prison yard, the gravel biting into the soles of my shoes, the wind tugging at my sleeves. I watched a line of birds cross the sky, imperfect, straggling, unhurried. I thought of how they owed no one anything. They never apologized for flying where they wanted or for leaving behind those who couldn't follow. They didn't ask the sky's permission. They simply moved. That afternoon, I stopped apologizing in my thoughts. It was quiet, internal, a kind of defection from the woman I had been trained to be. The world didn't notice. The guards still called my number. The walls still hummed. But I felt the shift, like a spine straightening after years bent in submission. I began to reclaim my name, not the way others had said it, clipped or cautious or annoyed, but how I remembered it from childhood. Olivia. My name was Olivia Monroe. I was 41 years old. I had been a librarian before the bruises became more frequent than sleep. I had once known the smell of old pages and soft light on wooden shelves. I had once memorized the names of every woman who came into the shelter asking for a book and leaving with a whisper of hope. And now I was a woman who had killed a man. He wasn't just a man. He was the man who had carved himself into every part of me, who made me flinch at my own shadow, who twisted love into surveillance, touch into violence, silence into strategy. But the court didn't want his story. They only wanted mine, and they only wanted the parts that made me fit their box. Scared, weak, remorseful. I had felt remorse, yes, but not the kind they wanted. I didn't regret that he was dead. I regretted that I had lived so long in the world where I believed I couldn't stop him unless I broke something inside myself. In the quiet corners of the prison library, I began to read again. Not stories of love or redemption or mercy, but histories. Women who burned, women who walked, women who never said, "I'm sorry" to the fire they started. I found parts of myself in their pages, not the victim, not the martyr, but the silent figure who picked up the blade and said, "No more." I began to move differently. I no longer shrank when footsteps approached. I no longer offered my seat to women who had made cruelty their armor. I looked people in the eye, not out of defiance, but because I had stopped looking at the floor. Once, a guard dropped a tray near me, and I didn't apologize for standing in her path. She narrowed her eyes, expecting submission. I met her gaze and said nothing. And in that silence, I felt something rise in me, stronger than pride. It was dignity, fragile and raw, but real. The other women noticed too. One of them, Marla, slid me a folded paper in the laundry line. On it, she had written 3 words, "You walk taller." That paper lived in my shoe for weeks, smudged with sweat, soft at the edges. It reminded me that transformation doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in silence, like a breath drawn fully for the first time. I thought often about my mother during those months, how she had taught me to apologize before asking a question, how she had once whispered, "Better safe than right." I wondered if she had ever felt the heat of anger in her bones, the way I had that night. I wondered if she had simply learned to live with it, or if she had ever dreamed of escape. In the cell at night, I stopped rehearsing apologies in my head. I didn't rewrite the courtroom scene, didn't wish I had cried harder or begged for understanding. I accepted what I had done, and I mourned only the years I had spent erasing myself for the comfort of others. There was a woman inside me I had buried long ago, the one who once loved thunderstorms and black coffee, who could speak her mind without looking over her shoulder. She wasn't gone. She had been waiting. And now I let her breathe again. I didn't need forgiveness, not from the state, not from the people who judged me, not even from him, especially not from him, because I had already forgiven myself for believing too long, for staying too long, for surviving the only way I could, and I was done saying sorry for any of it. I was no longer a woman who asked for space in this world. I took it.